Thank you, Joel and Jeremiah. Thank you, Norma and Bob, for leading out in the song service. For Wes for helping out here this morning and leading out in the elders' parts. The book of Deuteronomy is actually split up into about 3 parts. The first 4 chapters talk about the review of Israel's history. The next part is the second sermon, Moses' sermons to his people, is review of the law. That starts in chapter 5. And the third sermon is a renewal of Israel's covenant with God. Now, if you read in Deuteronomy, here we get the story and the history of the 12 spies. This comes 40 years after the fact. The reason being that Moses had a whole new generation of people. He had a whole new army. Remember the curse, call it that. Because of their unfaithfulness, the Lord told them to turn around, and that none of those that were military age would see the promised land. So we all know the story, but we're not going to dwell on that. We're going to spend our time as the ramifications that came after their expedition. Now, when I was working on this sermon, I was in Deuteronomy mostly, and there's some text there, and I'll read them for you right now, that talks about the people's ideas. They're getting ready to enter the promised land for the first time. Verse 20, Deuteronomy 1, verses 22 and 23. Then all of you came to me, Moses is speaking, talking about the people. Then all of you came to me and said, let us send men ahead to spy out the land for us and bring back a report about the route we are to take and the towns we will come to. The idea seemed good to me, so I selected 12 of you, 1 man from every tribe. Well, there's almost a sermon right there. I thought, okay, they didn't, this was their own thinking. This was their own idea. They did what they wanted to do, not what God wanted to do, and we know that's what happened later. And I thought, there's almost a sermon right there in those ramifications of what happened. But if you actually go to the original story, it's in Numbers 13. Numbers 13, verses 2 through 4. Actually, we'll start with 1. We'll start with verse 1. Numbers 13, 1 through 4. The Lord said to Moses, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders. So at the Lord's command, Moses sent out from the desert of Paran all of those that were leaders of the Israel, and these are their names, and it goes on down the list. Okay. Now, we know that they say all the time that the Bible interprets itself, and I unfortunately, here's a place where it a little bit contradicts itself too. So, whether Moses, when he was writing Deuteronomy, had a lapse of his memory, we really don't know. We know in one place it says that the Lord called to their direction to do this, and the other one, they did it on their own. In any event, the outcome was not very good. Okay, 11 days after leaving Mount Horeb, the Hebrew host encamped at Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran. This was not far from the borders of the promised land. Here is what was proposed by the people. Now, this is Ellen White talking about Deuteronomy 1, 20, 22, and 23. Proposed by the people that the spies be sent to survey the country. The matter was presented before the Lord by Moses, and permission was granted with the direction that one of the rulers from each tribe be selected for this purpose. The men were chosen as had been directed, and Moses bade them to go into the country and see what it was, its situation, its natural advantages, and the people that dwelt therein, whether they were weak or strong, few or many, and to observe the nature of the soil, its productiveness, and to bring forth the fruit of the land. They went and surveyed the whole land, entering at the southern border and proceeding to the northern extremity. They returned after an absence of 40 days. Now, one of the maps that's in my Bible shows the outline of that, and it says they covered about 500 miles in this venture. The people of Israel were cherishing high hopes and were waiting in eager expectancy. The news of the spies' return was carried from tribe to tribe and was hailed with rejoicing. The people rushed out to meet the messengers who had safely escaped the dangers of their perilous undertaking. The spies brought specimens of the fruit, showing the fertility of the soil and at the time of ripe grapes, and they brought a cluster of grapes so large that it was carried between two men. They also brought figs and pomegranates, which grew in abundance there. So this season is probably late summer when they got back, based on this time and what we know of the time frame. The children of Israel had camped about a year at the base of Mount Sinai. So it was probably about a year and a half after they had left Israel that we're talking about here. The people rejoiced that they had come into possession of such a goodly land, and they listened intently as the report was brought to Moses. Not a word should escape them. We came unto the land whither thou sendest, the spies began, and surely it floweth with milk and honey, and this is the fruit of it. The people were enthusiastic, and they would eagerly obey the voice of the Lord and go up at once to possess the land. But after describing the beauty and fertility of the land, all but two of the spies enlarged upon the difficulties and dangers that lay before the Israelites should they undertake the conquest of Canaan. They enumerated the powerful nations located in various parts of the country and said that the cities were walled and very great, and the people who dwelt therein were strong, and it would be impossible to conquer them. They also stated that they had seen giants, the sons of Anak, there, and it was useless to think of possessing the land. Now the scene changes. Hope and courage gave place to cowardly despair as the spies uttered the sentiments of their unbelieving hearts, which were filled with discouragement prompted by Satan. Their unbelief cast a gloomy shadow over the congregation, and the mighty power of God, so often manifest on behalf of the chosen nation, had been forgotten. The people did not wait to reflect. They did not reason that he had brought them unto them thus far, would certainly give them the land. They did not call to mind how wonderfully God had delivered them from their oppressors, cutting a path through the sea and destroying the pursuing hosts of Pharaoh. They left God out of the question and acted as though they must solely depend on the power of arms. Let's stop here for a moment and count the miracles. Like I said, it had been about a year and a half. First of all, we had 10 plagues before they ever left Egypt. Exodus 13, 21 and 22 says, a pillar of cloud by day and light by night. Now, we know that they said it was for light, but you got to remember in the desert it gets cold at night pretty fast because there's no humidity. So that light might have also kept them warm. Not only and they could travel at night because they could see very well. So they had the cloud to comfort them from the hot sun in the daytime, and the light to keep them warm and show them the way at night. Exodus 14, the miracle of the Red Sea, and we all know about that. Exodus 15, 22 through 25, the bitter waters at Morah were made sweet. Exodus 16, the quail, and we remember how they ate and made themselves sick. Because of all the quail, they were complaining that they didn't have the meat since they had left Egypt. And then after the quail came manna, every day but Sabbath for, a year, well over a year now. Because these things all occurred in the first 45 days after they had been set free. Deuteronomy 30 through 31. Deuteronomy 1, 30 through 31. The Lord your God, who is going before you, will fight for you, as he did for you in Egypt before your very eyes and in the desert. There you saw how the Lord your God carried you, as a father carries his son, all the way you went until you reached this place. In their unbelief, they limited the power of God and distrusted the hand that had hitherto safely guided them, and they repeated their former error in the murmurings against Moses and Aaron. This, then, was the end of our high hopes, they said. This is the land we have traveled all the way from Egypt to possess. They accused their leaders of deceiving the people and bringing trouble into Israel. We've all been camping, and from time to time, if you're really, really quiet, you can hear what people are talking about in the other tent. You know, Mrs. White talks about Moses and Aaron, how they probably walked through the congregation that night, the people, and how they could hear people talking and murmuring against them. And they were doing their best. They were doing exactly what the Lord had told them to do. And it just wasn't good enough. You can just feel for them. This then is the end of our high hopes, they said. This is the land we have traveled all the way from Egypt to possess. They accused their leaders of deceiving the people and bringing trouble unto Israel. The people were desperate in their disappointment and despair. A wail of agony arose and mingled in their confused murmur of voices. Caleb comprehended the situation, and bold to stand in the defense of the Lord, he did all in his power to counteract the evil influence of his unfaithful associates. For an instant, the people were stilled to listen to his words of hope and encourage respecting the goodly land. He did not contradict what they had already seen. The walls are high, the Canaanites are strong, but God has promised the land to Israel. Let's go up at once and possess it, he says, for we are able to overcome it. But the 10, interrupting him, pictured the obstacles in darker colors than at first. We be not able to go up against the people, they declared, for they are stronger than we. All the people that we saw in it are men of great stature. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come from the giants. And we were in their eyes as our sight as grasshoppers, and so we probably were in their sight also. Now, y'all remember Barbara Panada that was here the first 2 weeks of March, or most of you were here. The veterinary intern that was with me. She stood about 5'7", 8", I would say. Her husband is from Ecuador, and she says when they go to Ecuador and they play basketball, she gets to play center because she's the tallest person on the court. So you can kind of see a little bit about what these Israelites thought they were up against. And all the congregation lifted their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. Revolt and open mutiny quickly followed, for Satan had full sway, and the people seemed bereft of reason. They cursed Moses and Aaron, forgetting that God hearkened to their wicked speeches, and that, enshrouded in the cloudy pillar, the angel of his presence was witnessing their terrible outburst of wrath. In bitterness they cried out, "Would God that we have died in the land of Egypt, or would God we had died in the wilderness." Then their feelings rose against God. "Wherefore hath the Lord brought us into this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey? Were we not better to us to return to Egypt?" They said to one another, "Let us make a captain, and let us return to Egypt." Thus they accused not only Moses, but God himself of deception, in promising them a land which they were not able to possess. And they went so far as to appoint a captain to lead back to the land of their suffering and bondage, from which they had been delivered by the strong arm of omnipotence. Many of you that have worked cattle, and there's actually a system where we can use cattle's mentality to our advantage. You all know that cattle like to go back where they've always been. You know, you're moving cattle from one pen to another, and you get them all moved, but about two, and then all of a sudden they start going back, and before you can stop it, they're all back where they began. Well, that's not only cattle's nature, but evidently that's kind of human nature too. There is a system of handling cattle where you can actually make that work to your advantage. We won't talk about that today. In humiliation and distress, Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel, not knowing what to do to turn them from their rash and passionate purpose. Caleb and Joshua attempted to quiet the tumult. With their garments rent in the token of grief and indignation, they rushed in among the people, and their ringing voices were heard above the tempest of lamentation and rebellious grief. The land which they had possessed to search it which we passed through to search it, is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delight in us, then he will bring us to this land and give it to us, a land with flowing milk and honey. Only rebel not ye against the Lord, neither fear ye the people of the land. For they are bread for us, their defense is imparted from them, and the Lord is with us. Fear them not. Now, the Canaanites, God had it with them. In fact, I had given a sermon a couple years ago about looking at the first few chapters of Joshua and how they went through. This king was destroyed, and his people were destroyed, and this one was destroyed, and this one destroyed, and there are no survivors. They destroyed everything. Some of them they were told to kill everything that breathed. Some of them they were told to keep the cattle and the silver and gold as plunder, but kill all of the inhabitants. And the question was, how can a merciful God be such ruthless in ordering so many people killed? And the bottom line was that the Canaanites, we cannot understand the depth of their wickedness, giving their children, their sons and daughters, up to the idols, to sacrifice to the idols, and it was just detestable things that they were doing, and the Lord basically had it with them. And this is why he wanted them put down, and he was going to do it. But the false report of the spies was not acceptable to God, and so the whole congregation had to wait. And then 40 years later, under the leadership of Joshua, they went in and they did exactly what the Lord had wanted them to do 40 years earlier. The unfaithful spies were loud in denunciation of Caleb and Joshua, and the cry was raised to stone them. The insane mob seized missiles with which to slay their faithful men. They rushed forward with yells and madness, but suddenly the stones dropped from their hands. A hush fell upon them, and they shook with fear. God had interposed to check a murderous design. The glory of his presence, like a flaming light, illuminated the tabernacle. All the people beheld the signal of the Lord. A mightier one than they had traveled himself, and none dared continue their resistance. The spies who brought the evil report crouched terror-stricken and with bated breath sought their tents. The Lord promised to spare Israel from immediate destruction, but because of their unbelief and cowardice, he could not manifest his power to subdue their enemies. Therefore, his mercy bade them, as the only safe course, to turn back to the Red Sea. In their rebellion, the people exclaimed, "Would God that we have died in this wilderness?" Now this prayer was to be granted. The Lord declared, "As you have spoken in mine ears, so I will do to you. Your carcasses shall fall in the wilderness, and that all were numbered by you according to your whole number, from 20-year-olds on upward. But your little ones, which you said would be prey, them will I bring in, and they shall know the land which ye have despised." In Numbers, when they took the number of the fighting men, it was 603,550 that were 20 to 60 years old, and God says not a single one of you will enter the promised land. And Caleb, he said, "My servant Caleb, because he had another spirit with him, and hath followed me fully, him will I bring into the land whitherto he went, and his seed shall possess it." As the spies had spent 40 days in their journey, so the hosts of Israel were to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. This is probably the first instance of a day for a year, and that's found in Numbers 14:34. Moses is giving a history lesson here. The soldiers that day were the little children that they had talked about before. But your little ones, which shall be prey, I'll bring them in. This is now his fighting army at this time. When Moses made known to the people the divine decision, their rage was changed to mourning, and they knew that their punishment was just. The 10 unfaithful spies, divinely smitten by plague, perished before the eyes of all Israel, and in their fate the people read their own doom. The 10 unfaithful spies did not live very long. I think they were doomed because of the plagues that fell upon them fairly quickly. The night was spent in lamentation, but in the morning came a hope. They resolved to redeem their cowardice. When God had forbid them to go up and take the land, when he had bid them to go, they had refused. And now when he directed them to retreat, they were equally rebellious. They determined to seize upon the land and possess it. It might be that God would accept their work and change his purpose toward them. God had made it their privilege and duty to enter the land at the time of his appointment, but through their woeful neglect, that permission had been withdrawn. Satan had gained his object in preventing them from entering Canaan, and now he urged them to do the very thing in the face of the divine prohibition that they had refused to do when he required it. Thus, the great deceiver had gained the victory by leading them to the rebellion the second time. They had distrusted the power of God to work with their efforts in gaining possession of Canaan, and now they presumed upon their own strength to accomplish the work independent of divine aid. We have sinned against the Lord, they cried. We will go up and fight according to all that the Lord our God commanded us. Deuteronomy 1:41. So terribly blinded had they become by the transgression. The Lord had never commanded them to go up and fight. It was not his purpose that they should gain the land by warfare, but by strict obedience to his commands. How often we today, when things don't go as the way we expect, we make the comment, well, I'll just do it myself. You know, some people say if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself. Well, not always in the Lord's situation. Though their hearts were unchanged, the people had been brought to confess the sinfulness and folly of their rebellion at the report of the spies. They now saw the value of the blessing which had so rashly cast away. They confessed that it was their own unbelief which had shut them out of Canaan. We have sinned, they said, acknowledging that the fault was in themselves and not in God, whom they had so wickedly charged with failing to fulfill his promises to them. Though their confession did not spring from true repentance, it served to vindicate the justice of God in his dealings with them. I'm just going to read Deuteronomy 1, verses 41 through 45. Then you replied, we have sinned against the Lord. We will go up and fight as the Lord our God commanded us. So every one of you put on his weapons, thinking it was easy to go up into the hill country. Remember now, this is Moses telling his second generation of soldiers what had happened to the first generation 40 years before that. But the Lord said to me, tell them, do not go up and fight, because I will not be with you. You will be defeated by your enemies. So I told you, but you would not listen. You rebelled against the Lord's command, and in your arrogance you marched up into the hill country. The Amorites who lived in those hills came out against you, and they chased you like a swarm of bees and beat you down all the way to Seir, from Seir all the way to Hormah. You came back and wept before the Lord, but he paid no attention to your weeping and turned a deaf ear to you. The trumpet sounded an alarm, and Moses hastened after them with the warning, wherefore now do ye transgress the commandment of the Lord, but it shall not prosper. Go not up. What was missing when they decided to go and take on the Amorites themselves? No Ark of the Covenant, no Moses, and most importantly, no blessing from God. Go not up, for the Lord is not among you, that ye be smitten before your enemies. For the Amalekites and the Canaanites are there before you, and ye shall fall by the sword. The Canaanites had stationed themselves up on rocky tableland reached only by difficult passes and a steep and dangerous ascent. The immense numbers of the Hebrews could only render their defeat more terrible. They slowly threaded the mountain paths, exposed to the deadly missiles of their enemies above. Massive rocks came down, thundering down, marking their path with the stain of their blood, the blood of the slain. Those who reached the summit, exhausted with their ascent, were fiercely repulsed and driven back with great loss. The field of carnage was strewn with bodies of the dead. The army of Israel was utterly defeated. Destruction and death was the result of that rebellious experiment. Forced into submission, at last, the survivors returned and wept before the Lord. But the Lord would not hearken to their voice. Deuteronomy 1:45. By their signal victory, the enemies of Israel, who had before awaited with trembling approach of that mighty host, were inspired with confidence to resist them. All the reports they had heard concerning the marvelous things that God had wrought for his people, they now regarded as false, and they felt that there was no cause for fear. The first defeat of Israel, by inspiring the Canaanites with courage and resolution, had greatly increased the difficulties of the conquest. Nothing remained for Israel but to fall back and to face their victorious foes into the wilderness, knowing that there must be a grave of a whole generation, 40 years as God had promised. May 14th, 1804, 211 years ago Thursday. The Corps of Discovery. Anybody know what that was? Well, we don't ask teachers, they know. Anybody else know what the Corps of Discovery was? How about the Lewis and Clark expedition? Anybody heard of that? 11 men enlisted. Spies there were 12. Lewis and Clark and 9 others. But the total expedition consisted of, oh, she doesn't know, 33 people. Okay. They left St. Charles, Missouri, 4 p.m. on May 14th, 1804. And by August 20th, 1804, they were in the vicinity of the present Sioux City, Iowa. This is where Charles Floyd died, apparently of an appendicitis attack, and he's the only casualty in that 29-month trip. He was one of the first ones of the 9 to enlist. Now, 40 years is over. God is getting ready to lead his people back again. He can tell, he's actually watching, he knows how many people are left, and he actually tells them to start moving. And he tells them it's time to start moving, head north. And they did that. And he's giving them instructions as to what to do when they're going to enter the promised land. Deuteronomy 2, verse 6, it says, let's start with 5. Do not provoke them to war, for I will not give you any of their land, not even enough to put your foot on. I have given Esau the hill country of Seir as his own. You are to pay them in silver for the food you eat and the water you drink. So there was some land that God had given to Esau, so they would not get that. And then you go to verse 18, 2:18. Today you are to pass by the region of Moab at Ar. When you come to the Ammonites, do not harass them or provoke them to war, for I will not give you possession of any land belonging to the Ammonites. I have given it as a possession to the descendants of Lot. And then verse 28, if you go further on down to verse 28, it says, sell us food to eat and water to drink for their price in silver. Only let us pass through on foot, as they had asked the descendants of Esau to do earlier. Thomas Jefferson had a silver coin minted, especially for the Corps of Discovery expedition. And Meriwether Lewis was to give these to the tribal leaders, plus other things that they had put together as gifts for the people they went to, the areas they went through. The journey was almost lost. We know that the United States, other than the war that they fought for independence, the 13 colonies, all the rest of the United States was put together by purchases. None of it was taken by warfare. And this was God's command to the Israelites. They were to follow him. They thought they had to provide warfare. He had other things in mind. The journey was almost lost. U.S. General James Wilkinson, who we found out later was a paid spy for Spain, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, he had sent word to the Spaniards that this Corps of Discovery expedition was about ready to embark. They didn't get word back to him to go after him until August 1st of 1804. It was his duty to intercept the Corps of Discovery and take them all as prisoners for Spain. They believed that the Americans were encroaching on territory claimed by Spain. They sent an expedition of 52, leaving Santa Fe on August 1st, 1804. When they reached the Platte River in central Nebraska, they learned that the Corps of Discovery had been there many days earlier and that they were covering about 70 to 80 miles per day. Wilkinson and his forces never caught up. Excuse me a second. Okay, here we go. When we read in Joshua 10, verses 7 through 10, and this is the time when the children of Israel were going into Canaan and they were in the process of subduing it, and they had some tremendous military victories and other victories which the Lord had provided, like Jericho and whatnot. There's in that point there in Joshua 10, 7 through 10, it says that 70 miles, that they went 70 miles to take on some fighters from the north. Some people believe that this was all done in one night. Other people believe, other theologians believe that it was 5 days and the last leg of it had occurred at night and that they'd actually went through friendly territory to get there. But it was all on foot. They never used horses or chariots, and we know that when they caught up with a lot of their enemy, they burned their chariots and they hamstrung their horses so that they would not be good for pulling at any time. Why do you think the children of Israel never used horses or chariots? Mrs. White says that it was the Lord's contention that if they used horses and chariots, that they would begin to have their faith and their trust in the horses and the chariots, and that he did not want that. He wanted them to put their trust in him. So whatever they went that night, however it was, they did it on foot. July 3rd, 1806, the Blackfeet Nation sent some of their Indians to the Meriwether Lewis. He had split up. He and William Clark had split up, and he had 3 other people with him. And there was a skirmish that followed. The Blackfeet were trying to steal some of their weapons, and in this skirmish, two of the Blackfeet were killed. Lewis and 3 others traveled over 100 miles before they camped again, but they also did that with horses. Joshua died at age 110, buried in the land of his inheritance. Meriwether Lewis, killed by gunshot at age 35. Some believe it was murder, but most people believe that it was a suicide. Again, one person following God, one person following man. What a difference. Moses, in his farewell sermons, reminds the people why they are here. He admonishes them to keep the commandments. In chapter 5, Deuteronomy 5, he actually goes over all of the commandments verbally again. In chapter 5. In chapter 6, our scripture, he says, to love and teach your children. 6:3-7, which Wes read. Hear, O Israel, and be careful to obey, that may be well with you, and that you may increase greatly in the land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord your God, the God of your fathers, provided you. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. And now down in verse 10-13. When the Lord your God brings you into the house he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you a land with large flourishing cities that you did not build, houses filled with kinds of goods that you did not provide, wells that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. Then when you eat and are satisfied, be careful that you do not forget the Lord, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Fear the Lord, your God. Serve him only, and take your oaths in his name. It's pretty easy for us to get complacent with our material goods. And this was the warning that Moses had given the children of Israel. He says, you're going to inherit some land that's already set up, that has want of nothing. And as you recover this and the spoils of war, he asked them, whatever you do, do not forget the Lord your God. There's a message here for us today. We use the Old Testament stories so that we don't make the same mistakes ourselves. You know, our salvation is found in the New Testament, but a lot of the direction we need to go is still found in the Old Testament. And I pray that what we've heard today and that we've talked about today, that we'll remember that the Lord is still leading and the Lord is still guiding. Our closing hymn is number 573, When We All